Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's live talk, the latest in a series of expert dialogues brought to you by Bayer. Our topic today is biodiversity, a crisis rivaling climate change in urgency as the loss of species takes on unprecedented dimensions. My name is Melinda Crane, and it will be my pleasure to accompany you today as moderator. Perhaps you followed the latest biodiversity news, ladies and gentlemen. A study of plant life on 27 islands in the magazine Science demonstrates that humans significantly accelerated ecosystem change in pretty much every climate zone on Earth. As a result of human activity, around 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction worldwide over the next few decades. And as most of you undoubtedly know, that includes life forms with crucial systemic implications, like pollinators. Around 10% of insects overall face an existential threat over the medium term. And by the way, as we will hear later on, the loss of biodiversity could also trigger future pandemics on a par with COVID-19. We have invited two renowned guests to explore the causes of this mass extinction crisis and to highlight what we can do to address it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce both of them, beginning with Professor Josef Settele. He is a renowned expert on biodiversity in general and on the evolutionary biology of insects in particular. He heads the Department of Conservation Biology and Social Ecological Systems at the Helmholtz Centre for Environmental Research, and he also serves on the environmental expert panel that advises the German government. He's the former co-chair of IPBES, that stands for the Intergovernmental Platform of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And he joins us from Halle, Germany. Welcome, Josef.
Welcome, Melinda. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you with us. And it's a pleasure to welcome Matthias Barringer, who is a regular at these live talks. Since 2019, he has served as Senior Vice President for Public Affairs and Sustainability for Bayer. He's responsible for shaping Bayer's ESG strategy and for helping realize the corporate ambition of, quote, helping more people thrive within the planetary boundaries. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Great to see you again, Matthias.
Hi, good afternoon to Berlin.
Thank you. Before we start the discussion, a quick word on how you can participate in our talk, ladies and gentlemen, because we are very eager to hear your short comments and questions. Please do use the comment function for this purpose, and I'll bring in your questions a little bit later on. So you, ladies and gentlemen, have actually already begun sharing your opinions with us in a poll that we took in advance of this webcast. We asked how many species are currently threatened with extinction according to the World Conservation Union. And I'm hoping we can briefly get our poll results up on the screen now. And the results are we able to see those on the screen? Yeah, okay, great. So the largest share of you said 37,000, and in fact, you were correct, but just a little bit short of the mark, because the fact is that over 37,000 species are currently threatened with extinction, and that is more than 28% of all the species that the World Conservation Union assessed in this survey. So let's start by getting Josef and Matthias' take on that, and also by hearing a little bit more about your personal links to this topic. And Josef, you recently published a book entitled The Triple Crisis, in which you explore biodiversity, climate change, and pandemics, and warn that if we don't do more to halt climate change and biodiversity loss, we could see a lot more in the way of pandemics. So talk to us a little bit about how the human impact on wildlife is to blame for the spread of viruses.
Well, in principle, it's a matter of, let's say, diversity out there in the nature. So if you have, let's say, heavily disturbed ecosystems, you have the effect that certain species, animals, mammals, for example, are more abundant than other ones. So you have dominance of very few species. And within these species, the chance or the risk that certain viruses and diseases can spread is, of course, higher because they are closer to each other. And if they get close to humans, then of course the chance is higher to have zoonosis effects. That's in very simple words. That's one of the main processes behind. There are some studies which prove this quite nicely, and many of the studies are more correlative. So it's kind of correlation which we can find there. It's very hard to pin down the details into the background. But in principle, that's the reason why we have, let's say, at least local outbreaks or epidemics. And then, of course, this in combination with our global connectedness leads to pandemics. So pandemic means it's a global issue. So that's in a very short version, the background. I always compare this with the diversity as a kind of stabilizing factor. And if you have a reduction of diversity, which leads to dominance of certain organisms or viruses, this is the thing which is the background here.
Thank you. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. But let me now ask you to take us back from this latest work to some of your very earliest endeavors. And I'm referring to a study of the effects of agricultural intensification in Philippine rice terraces. What did you find out there, and how did it impact your career?
And this was my master's and PhD study, which I did back in the 1980s, so just recently, so to say. And well, I was kind of let's say, a colleague of mine came back with some study results, some material, some specimens, which they asked me to have a look at. And that's where I got interested in the topic of, let's say, agrodiversity in such very interesting, very complex, also very beautiful systems. I worked on the rice terraces mainly. This is kind of in northern Luzon, Philippines. And my idea was, it's an old land use system, so it might be that this system is very well balanced, so to say, and it might, let's say, be one of the reasons why we have not huge problems of pests, for example, in such areas. So I made my study comparing modified or newer system with more intensity, more growing periods with older ones. But I noticed in this study that in the end, it was mainly about landscape structure, about size of rice fields, etc., which is the reason for, let's say, having kind of balanced interactions of species, which means you have more predators, more parasitoids, which fight against the pests, which leads to this kind of very balanced system, which actually even holds true for lowland rice. So I later extended the research in Asia on rice, also in the flat, large areas, in close link with IRI, by the way, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, where I was somehow affiliated with some colleagues, but I was funded by the German foundation for my study in the Philippines. This was a starting point on this interaction in agroecosystems. So far from here, far from my home place in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much. And we're going to come back to the topic of agriculture and biodiversity in just a moment. But first, let me go to Matthias. And while Josef was wading through those rice terraces in the Philippines, you had just joined the German Green Party and become one of its youngest parliamentarians ever. And I know that back then, but also still today, you are very fond of hiking. So could you tell us, have you yourself observed changes in nature over the years?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the moment that for me made biodiversity a huge political topic was in 1992 at the Rio conference, where interestingly, biodiversity and climate change were equally being discussed. So what we see today, that everybody talks about climate change, but the biodiversity loss has kind of a back row seat in the conversation, wasn't the case some many years ago. And I think that's one of the challenges we have in the biodiversity conversation that happened. I mean, the most striking example for me that something is wrong was actually a longer walk in West Africa in a cocoa region, because people started to pollinate cocoa trees by hand, simply because the pollinators weren't there to secure a really good harvest. And that was kind of a striking moment for me, where I kind of could see that what nature-based capital really means. Yeah. So and when you're looking at other trees like almonds, for example, and many other plants, you come to realize how complex those systems are and what kind of nature-based contributions we take for granted when they are not there anymore. It's a bit like with water. Yeah. We value water as if it was always there until the moment it's not. Yeah, and that's my most striking experience.
Thank you very much. Let's drill a little bit deeper on biodiversity loss and its causes. And Matthias just referred to nature-based capital. The IPBES report that you co-chaired, Josef, refers to a different metaphor. It says biodiversity is humanity's most important safety net. And it notes that the net is shrinking and fraying. So what are the main causes of that? What human activities are most directly implicated in biodiversity loss?
Yeah, within this global assessment, we have tried to, let's say, find a kind of hierarchy of the main drivers behind. If you look at the direct drivers, we could quantify for the last 50 years at least, having land use change as the most important driver, followed by direct exploitation. For example, in the marine areas, very obvious, fishing, for example. Number 3 already was climate change, although it's only the last 50 years, not now, it's history. It's already there, it's quite some importance, followed by environmental pollution and invasive species, very roughly spoken. So these are the kind of, let's say, priorities we could see, priorities in quotation marks. This is based on a number of limited studies because most scientists tend to study one driver and look at their effects, but interactive studies looking at more drivers are quite rare. So it's only a few hundred studies, which is not a lot compared to what is out there on other topics. Just if you take pollination as an example, we have 250,000 roughly publications on pollination now in Web of Science, just to give you the dimension. So it's very hard to keep the overview. So we try to extract this knowledge, in this case, on the priorities, on the main factors, the main drivers, the main direct ones I mentioned, and then there are the indirect drivers. It's all about values and human activities. It's about socioculture, it's about demography, it's about technology, it's about economics, it's about war, it's about epidemics, for example. These are some of the things you mentioned before this epidemic happened, by the way. But these ones are not so easy to prioritize because they all heavily interact. But this is the kind of the overall global picture.
And Josef, would you say that expansion of agriculture is high on the list of culprits? I know you've mentioned that in past interviews.
Well, the more area we need for agriculture, the less we have for other purposes, of course. So, of course, you can see agricultural land is partly also land for certain agrobiodiversity, of course. But you lose quite a lot of other areas, especially in tropical countries like Brazil is a prime example, I think, for this, where the enlargement of agriculture areas surely is a major driving factor which causes the loss of many species.
Matthias, do you see your own company's activities implicated here? I know that Bayer says it aims to help conserve biodiversity, but as a manufacturer of pesticides, are you also part of the problem?
Absolutely. I think that the whole ag value chain is a huge part of the problem in the area of biodiversity loss as well as in the area of climate change. Yeah, I mean, a quarter of all GHG emissions are somehow attributed to the ag value chain. That for me is pretty clear. The big question is how can we kind of square this challenge of, on the one hand, having an increased demand for agricultural products because we have an increasing number of fairly wealthy people around the world, and on the other hand, the very strong need to stop land use change. So, for example, our climate policy is worth nothing if deforestation continues to ravage at current pace. So how can we, on the one hand, stop deforestation, but on the other hand, meet the demand that is globally going up? And I give you one striking example for that. The previous record of monthly grain imports in China was from September 2015. Which was 4.1 million tons being imported in 1 month. The latest record of January of this year was more than 6 million tons being imported in China in a single month. And that is an effect that currently puts huge pressure on land use change, on how to do sustainable agriculture. And for Bayer, the question is, how can we achieve both a more sustainable approach to agriculture and an intensification that meets that demand?
Nonetheless, it is the case, of course, that Bayer does produce chemicals that kill insects. So, Josef, I know you have a particular interest in butterflies. What is your position on the use of pesticides in general? And do they indeed have a harmful effect even on non-target insects such as butterflies?
Well, starting with the general attitude, well, I'm a friend of this integrated pest management approaches in the old definition, which means as a last resort, you use pesticides to really fight your enemies if there's nothing else which can help. And I guess this has changed in the last years that maybe pesticides are used a bit earlier than I would like them to be used. But I'm not completely against them because in many cases, there is no alternative. Take an example, for example, you have this invasive fly, which is affecting cherry trees in Europe. And it also goes to vineyards, for example. And as an invasive species, there's hardly any kind of natural enemy. So if you want to save your harvest, even partly in nature conservation areas, that's one of the cases where I would say, okay, this is the last resort. You have to use them in order to, let's say, guarantee your yield, your results, so the results of your efforts. And of course, looking at butterflies and other organisms which are not the target, well, we normally don't have so specific insecticides or pesticides which are only targeted in one organism or one species. Very hard to achieve this. So you always have this kind of side effects, which is always coming with the application. So in the end, it's a matter of, let's say, balancing this and looking at the pros and cons of how to use pesticides. Of course, as they are insecticides in this case, their task is to kill insects. So nobody should be surprised about this. Sometimes I notice in discussion, people are, okay, insecticides are good because they kill the pests, but they shouldn't kill the other things. But they are insecticides. So you have to be aware there's nothing. If it wouldn't work like this, you would have done something wrong in developing this kind of substances, I would say. So I think it's a balanced view, but of course the trend should be, as we all agree, I think, to use less and less of these. And there are some good examples, some good data, for example, from France from the last, that was published 2 or 3 years ago, where you can achieve similar yields with the same or similar production methods or same crops with 70% less insecticides, for example. It's not so easy with herbicides and fungicides. It's more difficult. But insecticides have quite some options for quite some reduction. So if we nowadays discuss about reduction, so there is the extreme position, we only do everything organic without any pesticide, or we just use pesticide everywhere. But that's not the question for me. For me, the question is always, you have an aim to move closer to, let's say, using much less of these. If we have achieved, let's say, 70%, then we can discuss about the rest. But at the moment, there's still a long way to go to achieve this.
What you've just described, there's a certain vicious circle to that, because we have these invasive species partly because of other human action, including climate change, and then to essentially get them under control, we have to resort to yet another intervention. Is that something we just simply have to accept as that in a sense one form of human intervention begets another?
I think to some extent, yes. Especially with invasive species, as soon as they have arrived, it's very hard to get rid of them. It's very hard to get something extinct which you want to get extinct, while on the other hand, to get those extinct you don't want to drive to extinction. It's a kind of, let's say, strange situation. So preventive measures, not to have too many invasive species, is really important. But as you know, there is no glory in prevention. So if you're successful there, it's very hard to communicate. We see it in the pandemic, for example. So I guess, yes, we have to do interventions, because once we have started as mankind to intervene with our environment, so I guess it will always be something like this. We always have to find ways to, let's say, lots of fantasy in doing constructive interventions, which should not cause too much harm to us. That's very idealized, but that's how it is, I think.
Let me go to Matthias and ask whether awareness of the effects of mass extinction and also of vicious cycles of the sort we're talking about has risen within Bayer and perhaps amongst industry players in general. And what steps are you at Bayer taking quite concretely?
Yeah, I think awareness has risen in part based on the data that we all are confronted with. So insect population decline is a data point that you need to deal with. One of the challenges I have when I look at the debate about science is that people tend to like data that confirms their point of view, and the inconvenient data they tend to ignore. And I think for Bayer, I can say that with Science for a Better Life being our mantra, we can't ignore the inconvenient data. And therefore, things have to change. But also we learned the hard way. Take the example of the neonicotinoids that have been introduced. They were the holy grail of insecticides because they were not as harmful to humans as the previous generation of chemistry. People didn't realize, though, the effect on pollinators. And then when the effect became clearer, there was a bit of a stubborn reaction also of companies like Bayer, which led to regulation that first went into the direction of an outright ban, for example, in Europe. And now it's like a ban with some little exemptions. And those regulatory activities are helpful for us because they help us to think about our future portfolio in very different ways. The environmental impact of pesticides needs to be reduced. We can't solve the problems of this century with the chemical solutions of the last century. And sometimes I feel that's a problem in our industry. And one of the things I observe is that there are a few companies that invest a lot in research, but there are a lot of companies that basically are totally fine selling generic products which are higher environmental impact, even though better solutions exist. And how we can change that practice across the industry is one of the things we are scratching our heads about.
Thank you very much. Let's then dig a bit deeper in terms of solutions and steps that can be taken to preserve biodiversity. And Josef, perhaps we can start out by very directly letting you address Bayer. What steps would you want to see this major global player take? And how does agriculture need to change in general to stop species loss?
Well, starting with the latter point, I think agriculture needs, well, everybody talks about sustainability, of course, but what does this mean? So in the end, I think it's moving in a direction where agriculture is all of us first. So it's the whole community, the whole society. It's not just the farmers. That's an important point to make. Because farmers are just those people who, let's say, do things because society seems to expect this. I say it seems because it's not always the case, but that's the perception they have, at least many of them. But I think there are ways where you can improve agriculture, especially if the consumer side is, let's say, demanding different goods. So looking, for example, a well-known example is the meat consumption. If we have too much meat consumption, we need much more area for the same number of calories we consume compared to, let's say, more plant-based solutions. I'm not a vegetarian myself, by the way. I like to eat good food, good meat from a nice kettle, a nice steak, for example, for a barbecue. That's great. But I think having this kind of everyday meat is surely something we can improve. And this would also lead to different production systems, of course. And this, for example, if you take the German example, if you look from Germany, what we consume and how much impact we have also outside Germany. So you might afford doing some, let's say, having some nice landscapes, having some nice biodiversity, and take all the negative things, soybeans, whatever it is, from the outside and bring it into our country. And this surely is not a solution. So we have to think about partly to incentive, to put more intensity into agriculture. Intensity could be very different things, by the way. Could be inputs, could also be labor, could be knowledge. So for me, modern agriculture is a knowledge-based agriculture, dealing with these problems in a kind of, let's say, more sophisticated way. And I think that comes to the point where also Bayer surely is playing a role and can play also a more important role in the future to really help improving the knowledge base in agriculture, to have this kind of, let's say, solutions which are more subtle, more complicated, but maybe also more, more sustainable in the end. So that's a very general statement, but I think that's something which covers the whole thing. Going back to this consumption things, if we are consuming like we do, then we just simply afford, let's say, exporting extinction to other parts of the globe. Something people don't necessarily think about. If you have a nice setting in your hometown, in your surroundings, that looks nice, and you have some good food, okay. But you have to think beyond this. And our environmental impacts of consumption, there was a recent study on this, is around 80% outside Europe for the European Union. That's something we really have to change. So there's a role for everybody there, but also for us locally, which means to some extent also that we have to think about at least partly also more intensive agriculture in order to, let's say, spare space for other purposes. It's not a silver bullet, but it's one component. I am always in favor of this one, to include it in the discussion.
Before I ask Matthias to respond to that, may I just bring in one question or comment really from the audience, because you talked about needing essentially to use current measures to deal with current problems rather than looking to past ones. This question reminds us that past practices can perhaps sometimes be very effective. And the comment comes from Leah Schmidt, who is Vice President of Content Marketing at Insider. And she says, also, some of the more recent agriculture practices are less efficient than ancient techniques. Grape growing, for instance, using the mound method. Would you like to say a word about looking back toward perhaps more small-scale traditional methods?
Yeah, okay. Well, of course, this is one of the things we also highlighted in the global assessment. It's about indigenous and local knowledge. So both local and indigenous, could be both. And there are many methods which have been developed on a very local scale, which might even be suitable for upscaling, but at least in the place where they have evolved as a cultural process, they have very good solutions to land use. So I guess the small scale local experience background is surely an important one. That means you have to look backwards as well as forward. So looking forward by using things where the experience is already there, surely it's an important component. So I think, yes, that's an important one.
Matthias, by 2050, there will be 10 billion people in the world. And as you pointed out, we are going to have to feed them, and we will need to devise intensive methods for doing so. So how can we do that without this uncontrolled expansion of agriculture that can, in fact, shrink the spaces needed for species?
I think the first thing we need to do is really take concerted action to stop deforestation. Because, as I said before, if we don't stop deforestation, we will not achieve our climate targets, and the world's climate gets even more out of control. And one of the things that distinguishes agriculture, let's say, from oil and gas production is that agriculture contributes to climate change, but also farmers are suffering from it. And it doesn't matter whether you are a small or a large farm, you have huge means or not, climate change doesn't make a difference when it comes to droughts or other extreme weather events. So we need to halt deforestation across the ag value chain. We need to make a huge contribution to make that happen. So that for me is a starting point. And then I think we need to throw everything and the kitchen sink at this problem. So yes, for example, there's a lot we can learn from organic farming about reducing fertilizer use, increasing soil health, and we need to cherish these innovations as innovations. At the same time, we can't ignore that it takes a different agriculture to feed 8 or 9 billion people compared to one that fed 1 billion people. And that dimension is often forgotten. In my lifetime, the world population doubled. The land being used to feed it did not double. And that is because a lot went into driving more efficiency. However, we paid a price for how we drove the efficiency. So what are the innovations? I'll give you one example. We talked about also in other conversations. We are working on introducing a short corn by mid of this decade, which basically allows to produce the same amount of corn on 20% less land, with less fertilizer being needed, more carbon being absorbed in the soil, and better resilience against both storms and droughts. Yeah, these are the kind of, in this case, seed-driven innovations we need. We need a different chemistry. We need digital agriculture, by the way, not only in the rich countries, also in the smallholder-driven poorer countries in the world, which can leapfrog a lot of the agricultural practices. And. So I think we need to be really open to innovation, and we need to leave the traditional kind of conversation where people appear to have a solution for a problem, at least from what I can see, where nobody yet came up with really a good solution that addresses all of those challenges. And the oil conversation, well, it might be bad for the environment, but it feeds people, is as wrong as the conversation that says, well, I don't really care as much about feeding the people because the environment goes off the rail. Yeah, so This is not how it works. We need to solve both problems at the same time. And for that, we need to partner and think differently, also across huge controversies of the past.
And Matthias, a question just has come in addressed to you from the assistant manager of group accounts at the PRAN-RFL group. He is Kabir Udin, and he says, could you please tell us about Bayer's role in developing countries like my country, Bangladesh, in regard to the biodiversity crisis?
Well, first of all, we have decided to focus more on smallholder communities in general. When Bayer built this large crop science company combining the old Bayer and the assets of Monsanto, we realized that one area where both companies didn't focus as much as it would be right is the smallholder area. So that is an area where we spend much more time now. And the idea is to help those smallholders to achieve sustainable intensification. Also, the realization that smallholder farmers are a backbone of global nutrition. So the idea that what smallholder farmers are doing today is somehow outdated is an idea you can only have if you don't look closely what's going on in Bangladesh, in many regions in India, in communities in Africa. And by focusing, by also allowing smallholder farmers access to, for example, modern seeds without charging them on the IP side in the way we would do in richer countries, all of those elements really play an important role. First and foremost, including in Bangladesh, though, we dialed up our game and helped smallholder farmers who suffered from the COVID crisis. And currently, that region of the world really is hugely under siege of the pandemic. So that is something that is for us at the moment a topic we spend a lot of time on. How can we help those communities to better deal with a pandemic that we can't even deal with well, despite having all the means that are at our fingertips in the United States or Germany or other rich countries.
Thank you very much. And let me go to Josef and ask, beyond companies like Bayer, and you mentioned yourself that, for example, you do still eat meat. This is a discussion that we often have on these webcasts, whether we as individuals can and must change our behavior, and to what degree that can really help solve these profound crises that are so massive that it sometimes seems daunting for individuals to even make a difference. So what would you want to see from individual smallholder producers in the way of change, but also from citizens and consumers?
Well, it's always, there are two sides. This is bottom-up and top-down approaches. So if you feel alone because you think you can't change the world, I think that's the wrong attitude. Everybody is a part of the entire system. So I guess as soon as people join together in doing something, you can achieve something, which you can notice by, let's say, civil activities. We had this kind of, how is it called? This Bürgerbefragung, this kind of initiative in Bavaria, which was based on lots of different people, actually. And suddenly there was a big crowd moving into the direction of having a different agriculture, different land use, which even convinced the Prime Minister of Bavaria to really adopt the entire proposal they made. So I'd always say it's a matter of individual behavior. One of these components is to convince your neighbors, of course, to convince the people around, but also leading by example. So you mentioned the meat consumption. Well, my background is mainly a cultural one where I say, if you take Central Europe, we have a huge cultural landscape. There is no primary forest left in Central Europe. It's all man-made, more or less. And also much of our biodiversity has co-evolved with human activities over time. So most or nearly all of our nature conservation areas are traditional land use systems. And many of these are, for example, grasslands, where grass is maybe one of the ways to use it. There's not necessarily a space for crops because the soil doesn't give this kind of yield you need there. But if you have grasslands, you need somebody who is, let's say, consuming the grass, which is the cows, for example. So having this kind of, let's say, landscape management idea, which produces, let's say, meat, produces milk, cheese, etc., is surely deeply embedded into our history. And I guess this is what I meant. If I once in a while have a brilliant steak coming from cattle, which is grown in a very, let's say, animal-friendly way, this kind of things. That's the thing I think of. Then you can combine landscape management, you can combine good food, you can maintain your, let's say, home area, this kind of things. So I guess this is one component. But in the end, if you consume this, of course, you have, as a consumer, you have to know what you're buying, and that's a tricky thing because oftentimes it's very hard. If you go to the supermarket, in our case, you don't invest half an hour to read all the details on the things that you want to buy to see whether it's okay or not. So this is another component where also the different companies, the ones selling food, for example, trading food, have to invest much more into this kind of transparency, and also in the way of, let's say, giving fair prices, for example, to farmers. So it's a whole bunch of activities. It always goes together. But I think you are never alone. As soon as you start talking about it, you notice there are many more people out there. So I never accept the excuse, I can't do anything, so I don't do anything. That's surely not the case.
Thank you very much. Before I go back to Matthias, let me just once again encourage everyone who's following us in the live stream, please do send us your comments and questions. We're very eager to hear from you, and then I will pass those on to our speakers. Matthias, perhaps you want to say a brief word to what we just heard from Josef at the end of his remarks in regard to transparency and reporting, essentially. I know that you have been instrumental in helping Bayer put into place science-based targets and also reporting mechanisms to make sure that consumers do have that information about the impacts of the company's products. Could you say a word about that? And then I have a follow-up as well.
I generally believe that we need to be much more transparent about the impact value chains of companies have. So if you look at Bayer being a quarter of the egg input industry in our space, so a quarter of the egg value chain is somehow impacted by us. And when you then look at water consumption or carbon emissions that are linked to that, you immediately realize we have a huge impact by way of looking at the value chain. Another example that illustrates that is that the carbon reduction target in absolute tons by 2030 of Walmart is as big as what the European Union just signed into law. Both want to reduce 1 billion tons of carbon by end of this decade. And to measure the impact is really crucial, and then to reward businesses for improving their overall environmental impact is something that I find absolutely crucial. So I'm happy that is part of our remuneration systems, which gets us right at the biodiversity conversation. How do we have an as good measure in the biodiversity space as what we have in climate, where we just need to reduce the GHG emissions to address climate change in a meaningful way? The complexity of the biodiversity challenge it makes that harder, but I think for business it's really important to get those very clear targets, which we then can be hold accountable against.
That's a great question. Let us put that straight to Josef and see whether you have thoughts on that. How could a target system be devised in the biodiversity area?
Yeah, that's a question I got asked very often, and I have to admit it's really very complicated, as Matthias has said. I think it's much easier with the greenhouse gas emissions because it's a simple kind of indicator you can use there, and we have very complex system in front of us. So we are using indicators, for example, for certain conditions of grasslands, for certain crops in Europe, for example. We have, let's say, these red list kind of approaches, but it's all very fussy and very difficult to really target. And I think it's very hard to find this kind of clear aim which says, okay, we have to increase the population of species X, Y, Z. It's more looking at the overall diversity. So we have certain aims, a certain, let's say, level of species richness, for example, for Germany, which has as an aim, which was a kind of, let's say, convention we did politically many years back or decades back, and we still stay around the 70%, and we can't get much further up in the last 20 years, although we tried to stop species loss. So there is a target, but it's very hard to fulfill this because the mechanisms behind are also very complicated. It's not that straight. You do something and something is the result of it. It makes it difficult. And of course, there are some targets on a global scale. Well, you can't reverse extinction because the species which are extinct won't reappear. So you have to, let's say, live at a certain level. You can only do it on a local scale. You have more diversity, for example. Look at number of species, or let's say number of species which, let's say, are removed from the red list, for example. That's one of the things we can use. But it's very tricky, it's very complicated. That's why it's also one reason, I guess, coming back to Matthias' comment before, because it's much easier to communicate also climate change and things you can do there compared to biodiversity. That's really one of the reasons. Yeah.
Which makes your book, Triple Crisis, so interesting in terms of linking the two. But I want to come to that in a moment. But I do have a couple more audience inputs here. Back to Matthias, I think, with this one, and it again regards smallholder farmers. And the question or comment comes from Lars Hendrik Simon, who says, digital agriculture sounds really like an option to reduce the amount of pesticides that are needed. However, is it realistic that this can be used by small to medium-sized farmers? On first sight, it sounds expensive, and farmers might fear that it's an investment that doesn't pay off. And then, of course, I would add, and perhaps digital infrastructure is not always in place for such farmers. But what are your thoughts on that, Matthias?
Yeah, the digital infrastructure is surprisingly good in low and middle income countries. You can see that in fintech as well, the rise of the cell phones. So the good news is you have an interesting infrastructure. And what we have seen, for example, with drone application of pesticides, both in Asia and in West Africa, is that the willingness of those very young, very entrepreneurial communities to try something totally new and to leapfrog what has been our way of doing agriculture for many, many years is very high. So I wouldn't underestimate both the infrastructure as well as the ingenuity of folks in that space. We work as one of our investments with a team at Apollo Ag, that basically tries exactly that leapfrog, tries to bring digital agriculture measures that team actually has worked on in the United States into smaller countries. A lot is possible. The other thing that I find really helpful on the digital side is, and Grow Intelligence is one of those halo startups in that space. Sarah Menker is working a lot on that, is to help farmers to better anticipate extreme weather events. Nothing is worse than basically a crop loss in which smallholders have invested a loss that you couldn't prevent based on predictable weather events coming further down the road. So there's a lot possible. I'm actually quite excited about what I've seen. And it's also not that we need to invent it. These inventions happen in those countries, and that's probably the coolest thing of all.
Thank you very much. And another question that I'd like to ask you about cooperation with also civil society partners, which you just mentioned briefly. There was a recent article in the German newspaper Die Zeit that talked about the fact that Bayer would like to cooperate more with ecological associations working in the area of biodiversity, but that most of them apparently wanted to, and this is a quote from the article, keep their distance. Is that correct? And if so, why do you think that is? And what can you say to them right here in this space to persuade them that it would make sense to talk?
I think we are in the reputational doghouse for many of those NGOs ever since we acquired Monsanto, because Monsanto somehow was a symbol of criticism. I think sometimes also people overshoot, because the innovation potential that company has been mobilizing is often wrongly attributed only with things that don't work. A lot of things actually work quite well, and we would have much bigger land use change without many of those innovations. We also wouldn't have the soil conserving no-till farming prevailing in the Midwest of the United States. But be it as it may, I think it's not really up to the NGOs, it's up to Bayer to demonstrate that we mobilize our innovation portfolio, our investments in R&D in sustainable intensification. So I'm okay with people being skeptical, especially when it comes to big businesses. I'm also okay with us being held accountable against, for example, commitments to reduce pesticides, to phase out older chemistry. So that's totally fine. And I think the only thing that's important is the old trenches don't really serve us well in the upcoming debate on how to feed 8, 9, 9.5, perhaps even 10 billion people.
Thank you very much. I have another audience comment that I'll just put out there, and maybe you want to speak to it. It is this, and it comes from Nandish Jalahali Rangagoda, who is a plant breeding master student at Wageningen University. And Nandish says the breeding company can influence the farmers to grow different suitable crops instead of monocrop in marginal lands and good lands, thereby decreasing the market fluctuation on a particular crop. Because of middlemen in India, we have more post-harvest losses. I think that the breeding companies have to step forward in this matter. Then there's no need for encroaching forest to increase agricultural land. And
yeah,
any comment?
I do believe that seeds need to have a seat at the table for this global solution. I think that better plant seeds are one of the key elements. I described it with the short corn in India example. We are currently exporting rice from India to the world that is being basically watered with groundwater, and the irrigation is not sustainable. The groundwater levels are falling really, really fast. The short-term profits are not really what is right in those regions. So transitioning rice from like paddy into dry-seeded rice is one example where seeds can make a huge difference that ultimately make farming communities both more sustainable and more resilient against rainfall patterns that are bound to change. So on top of that, we need to focus not only on a few cash crops, but also on what sometimes are called the orphan crops. So a smallholder focused strategy needs to look at orphan crops because they're often the feed and food backbone for farming communities. And since they are not growing in like the large agricultural regions in Russia, Ukraine, Europe, or South or North America, people have neglected them. That has to change as well. But most importantly, we need more people who move to top universities like Wageningen or to smaller universities in their countries and study that. I think there is a huge demand for science in the ag space. We are at Bayer one of the largest investors in agricultural R&D, but I think it needs states to invest much more. We won't solve that problem with industry investment in R&D alone. And that is a trend that I've seen, that companies are being accused of investing a lot, when in reality, the problem is that governments don't invest enough in R&D.
Thank you very much. Josef, let me come back now to your book, The Triple Crisis, and ask you to tell us a little bit more about the links in these complex interactions between the different crises. So taking biodiversity loss and climate change, and one example I would like to know more about, locust plagues, such as the one that we saw last year in Africa. Is that something that you would say is being caused, or at least being exacerbated by global warming?
Well, I think so. If you look at Ethiopia in the recent last year, for example, I guess it's very much linked to the, let's say, unpredictability of the weather conditions. If suddenly you have lots of rains, have a very, let's say, greenish period, and suddenly all these locusts can come up and develop. And I think it's surely an effect of climate change. And that's surely one example where it's very hard to have, let's say, ad hoc solutions to avoid this. No, I think that's one of the cases where you might even be forced to use this kind of, let's say, not favorable pesticides, for example, just to get rid of the problem on the local scale on the very moment, because just the locust eats all your food. So that's surely one example where climate change has an impact on biodiversity, and biodiversity has a strong impact, a negative one in this case, on our food supply. So surely that's an example, yeah.
And Matthias Barringer contributed to that fight against the locust plague last year. Can you tell us a little more about what you did there?
Yeah, I mean, we that's one of those examples where like a generation of pesticides has been used that normally wouldn't be approved in the European Union. So when you're basically say on a blanket level, you should never kind of use these kind of pesticides, you might run into real difficult situations. In the case of the locust crisis, once the FAO and the countries kind of agreed to some of those chemical interventions, They helped quite a few people, around 30 million people, to secure their livelihood, which generally is often forgotten in the conversation about pesticides or crop protection. And that is that a lot of crop is at risk of getting lost without fungicides, without certain interventions. The question is, can we better predict? Can we better target? Can we reduce the amount of pesticides we use in the future by combining digital properties with better seeds, with newer chemistry, and of course with the AI of predicting how weather events will affect certain challenges. So in many ways, as soon as it rained in the deserts on the Arabian Peninsula, it was predictable that those locusts are on their way. And we have been waiting too long. As soon as they are able to mate and increase the population in the way they did in East Africa, you only have like a very traditional archaic solution to it. Better predictive systems could help us because we will have more of that. Climate change will challenge farmers in securing their crop in ways that we haven't experienced in generations. That is probably something we all need to come to grips with as well.
Josef, could insect plagues also affect the occurrence of zoonotic diseases? Is there reason to fear that this could be a further link in a chain toward more pandemics?
Well, we have a lot of zoonotic diseases everybody knows of, like malaria, for example. So things which are, let's say, driven by insects. You have this Asian tiger mosquito, for example, which is entering Europe or Central Europe now, which is also a kind of virus transmitter. So I guess, well, there is a certain risk for zoonosis, yes, of course. Whether it would be a pandemic or an epidemic, that's something different. So in many cases, you have the chance to really prevent things in an early stage. So I guess it doesn't necessarily lead to more pandemics, but it's very hard to say because it's very hard to predict any kind of pandemic. You only can say by certain measures you can reduce the frequency. But as I said before, let's say working in this direction means, well, if you're very good, then you have this kind of, let's say, prediction, this kind of, prevention, which doesn't lead to any glory for the things you do. It's very hard to say, okay, we have been much better now because we had only one pandemic in 10 years instead of 5 or 6 of them. That's the tricky thing in selling it. But I think we still have to really look at this kind of precautionary approaches actually in the end. And what Matthias mentioned in the context of Africa and the locusts, of course, that's all kind of, let's say, precautionary thing. As soon as you know where the breeding grounds are, the starting point, that's where you can really catch them. That's something where you need this kind of, let's say, high-tech approaches. I think that's something where we can easily get together with a kind of solution, which in the end avoids the massive, let's say, application of outdated pesticides.
Thank you very much. It's interesting the point that you have made, I think, at 2 stages in the conversation about how difficult it is to show things that don't happen. This is a problem that we journalists face often, that it's very hard to report on success in the sense of things that didn't occur. So we tend to report much more on crises, of course, that do occur. Matthias, if I may, I'd like to come to you with another audience comment, and it is this, and it essentially goes to the question of skills development and capacity building. The question is from Thapanan R, and it is, European companies have awareness, but in Asia, a huge part of agriculture might require more education, and companies who invest on the land put more effort in education and technology in order to affect behavior. What is Bayer doing in that area?
Yeah, we believe that an investment in, for example, plant breeding capacity in Africa or in Asia is one of the things where we can contribute. We can also partner with research institutes on giving them more access to our knowledge in the area of plant science. So that's a huge one for us, but it starts with very basic things. So most of the innovations that help smallholders aren't actually agronomic. Yeah, it's about how do you reach farming communities? How do you achieve better life farming that goes beyond just the simple agronomic data? So social innovation is often the way to go, and a lot of social innovation is part of education. So almost half of all smallholder farms are women, and one of the challenges with women in smallholder farming is that that they basically have to be both successful in smallholder farming and they have to raise families. So family planning is one of the crucial things that would help them to become more effective.
Thank you very much. We're coming into just about the last 5 minutes of our talk, so I'd like to sort of widen out and look one more time at the big picture with both of you. Josef, first of all to you, in terms of biodiversity loss, is there one particular species or one particular development that is of greatest concern to you, where you would say this could set off a particular chain reaction that would be devastating?
Well, I think that's exactly the thing with the combination of the biodiversity loss and the climate change effects. So if you take, for example, the thawing of the permafrost areas and this kind of, let's say, bacteria, whatever is in there, which is suddenly getting out of it, which might affect us in terms of pandemics, for example, is surely one thing. So I would always think we have to tackle climate change in order to prevent more biodiversity loss, and we have to preserve biodiversity in order to, let's say, mitigate climate change. It has to go both together. There's not particular species. You can, of course, talk about the polar bear, which is a nice symbol, but it's just one species. It's kind of, let's say, people like to see. But I don't see a single organism. Maybe one system surely is there, which is the coral reefs in the tropics, which is really heavily under danger. Again, a combination of usage of fisheries, but mainly also of climate change.
And I wonder if you could just tell us, do you have a vision of a truly sustainable economy, and what would it be, briefly?
My vision would be that we all look more in the direction of sufficiency. So let's see what we really need. In the end, we consume quite a lot, we waste quite a lot, which we surely shouldn't do because we can't afford this. So it's a matter of the personal lifestyles, and this should also be reflected in politics, but also reflected in companies like Bayer and others. So I guess my vision is a vision of moving together in a direction with joint forces and not with the trenches mentioned by Matthias. I think it's about the way. It's not about the vision, how it looks like, but this is the way and the method we have to use in order to achieve a sustainable future.
And Matthias, also, if you like, please do share your vision. But if I look at that big picture in terms of Bayer, clearly, and you've said as much, Bayer is to some degree co-responsible in all of these interlinked crises. And at the same time, you aim to foster solutions like the ones that you've talked about by facilitating adoption of biodiversity conservation measures, by aiming for carbon neutrality by 2030, and most recently, interestingly enough, in regard to the pandemic, by working on a COVID-19 vaccine with CureVac. So, and that vaccine, of course, particularly suitable for use in the global south. So overall, and with as self-critical an eye as possible, how would you rate Bayer's net balance? I think you're on mute, but yeah, there you go.
That gives me 1 second to think about the question. So I would like to see more progress in the area of innovation and crop protection. In part, it means we need to be more intentional. I also think that regulators need to be more welcoming for innovation. It's very hard to kind of come up with new ideas because the regulation for market introduction is really mind-bogglingly slow. So if you think about herbicides, there are new herbicides in our pipeline, but the time it takes to get them to market is something that worries me. An area that I believe is one where Bayer needs to focus a lot is soil. I think like big companies didn't focus as much on smallholders, they also didn't focus as much on soil as I think we should. So soil is a big topic because it helps to remove carbon from the atmosphere to have more healthy soils. It also reduces the pest pressure on crops, and that's an area where I would like to see more activities. But generally speaking, the systemic relevance of companies like Bayer, and there are other big companies, Chinese-owned Syngenta, Corteva, also means that we have a huge responsibility to not defend all practices, but really paint a realistic picture of what sustainable intensification can look like. And that's our main job. Stop discussing things in the way they were discussed 10, 15, 20 or a generation ago.
And I hope this webcast made a bit of a contribution to exactly that goal. And certainly it seems to me that it did. So many, many thanks to both of you for sharing your views and your insights on biodiversity loss and for being with us in this webcast. And thanks as well, of course, to all of those working behind the scenes to make this possible, and especially to all of you in our audience for sharing your questions and comments and for giving us your attention over the course of the past hour. We will continue in our series of webcasts looking at other aspects of the challenges that we face. So please do check Bayer's LinkedIn page to get information on what is planned. Matthias mentioned a little bit earlier the topic of water, and that's certainly something that we would like to delve into in future. Until then, I wish all of you well, stay healthy, be safe, and hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
All right.